Have you ever found a place so still that even time seemed to slow down? A place where the air is soft, the light is gentle, and every sound feels like a memory you once knew. Tonight, I want to take you there, to a quiet farmhouse set at the edge of a golden field, where the evenings are wrapped in the scent of cut grass and the hush of the countryside. On the wide front porch, there's an old wooden swing, its paint worn thin by summers long gone, its gentle creak keeping rhythm with the breeze. It has been there for decades, swaying through countless sunsets, carrying stories in the silence between each sway. Some of those stories are still held in the air, like the warm breath of chamomile tea or the soft laughter of someone you once loved. And tonight, if you'd like, you can sit there too. So let's step onto that porch together and let the evening open its arms to us. Before we begin, I invite you to settle in. Let your shoulders sink into the bed, your hands resting loosely by your sides. Feel the weight of the blanket covering you, warm and familiar, like an embrace you've known for years. If you wish, take a slow, deep breath in. Hold it gently, and then release it, letting the air leave you as quietly as the fading light at the end of day. Do it again, just once more, breathing in the soft calm of the night and letting go of anything that has been pressing on you today. You're safe here. The world outside can wait. For now, there is only you, this quiet moment, and the gentle story we're about to share. If you've ever walked down a narrow country road in the late evening, you might know this feeling. The way the air cools after the sun has slipped behind the hills. The way the grass along the ditches glows faintly, touched by the last light, while the first stars begin to shimmer in the deepening sky. There's a hush that comes, not the silence of emptiness, but the deep, breathing stillness of a land that has been here far longer than you have. It's a kind of stillness that remembers. On such a road, tucked just beyond a bend where wildflowers lean lazily over the fence line, there is a house. A modest farmhouse built with care by hands that knew the shape of work and the value of rest. Its white paint has weathered into a soft gray, the edges smoothed by rain and years of sun. The porch stretches across the front, its wooden boards worn smooth by footsteps and by time, and there, in the center, hangs an old swing. The swing is made of oak, sturdy even after decades, though the paint has long peeled away. Its chains creak softly when the wind moves it, and in certain light, you can see the faint carvings on its armrest, initials, hearts, little marks of love and presence left by those who sat here before. It is not the kind of swing you find in a store. It is the kind that belongs to a place and to the people who have passed through it. Tonight, the air is mild and scented faintly with cut hay from the fields nearby. Somewhere to the west, the sun has already gone down, but a soft glow still lingers, painting the sky with bands of pale gold and lavender. Crickets begin their nightly song, joined by the low, steady hum of cicadas farther out. The sound is not loud, it's a backdrop, like a gentle reminder that life in all its small and steady forms carries on. Samuel steps out onto the porch, his mug of chamomile tea cupped between both hands. The steam rises in delicate swirls, catching the light from the small lamp beside the door. He's in no hurry. He rarely is these days. Time for him moves not by the ticking of the clock, but by the slower rhythms of morning light and evening shadows. He lowers himself onto the swing, feeling the familiar give of the old oak beneath him. The chains groan just a little, then settle into a slow, familiar sway. Samuel takes a sip of his tea. The taste is warm, touched with the sweetness of honey from his neighbor's hives. He closes his eyes for a moment and simply listens to the night, to the wind in the tall grass, to the unhurried pulse of the countryside. The porch boards beneath his feet hold their own kind of memory. He can almost feel the weight of past summers, the bare feet of children running across them, the heavy boots of a father returning from the fields, the soft tread of his mother carrying a basket of laundry fragrant with sun. This porch has heard stories told in the quiet hours after supper, and it has known the gentle silences that need no words at all. From where he sits, Samuel can see the outline of the fence at the edge of his property. The posts lean a little now, and the wire between them sags in places, but it's still there, keeping the small orchard safe from wandering deer. Beyond the fence, the land rolls gently toward the horizon, stitched with the gold of drying grasses and the dark green of late summer trees. A firefly blinks once near the porch, then disappears into the twilight. Another answers from somewhere out in the field. He smiles faintly at the sight. It's been years since he paid much attention to them, but here they are, carrying on as they always have. It's a reminder, he thinks, that the world has its own quiet ways of enduring. Samuel leans back against the swing's wooden slats, feeling the gentle push and pull of its motion. The tea warms his hands, the evening air cools his face. It's a kind of balance he's learned to appreciate more and more. How the world offers both warmth and coolness, both sound and stillness, and how both are needed. He glances toward the far corner of the porch, where an old pair of boots sits by the railing. They belong to his father, and though Samuel no longer wears them, he's never had the heart to move them. The leather is cracked, the soles worn thin, but they remain, a quiet monument to the man who once sat in this very swing and watched the same fields as the sun went down. For a moment, Samuel imagines his father here again, perhaps sipping coffee instead of tea, nodding at the way the wind bends the grass. There is no sadness in the thought, only a kind of gentle gratitude that he knew a man who could teach him, without ever saying it outright, how to live simply and with care. A soft breeze rises, carrying with it the faint smell of the creek beyond the orchard. It's a smell Samuel has known since childhood, a mix of water and earth and the cool green scent of willows. He takes another sip of tea and lets the swing move a little more, its steady rhythm matching the quiet beat of his heart. The world is unhurried tonight, and so is he. The swing moves as if it knows the shape of the evening, not fast, not slow, just enough to carry a gentle breath from one moment to the next. Samuel lets his heels rest on the porch boards, not pushing, only letting the small lift of the night wind do the work. The mug warms his hands, the air cools his face. The light at the door spills a small circle across the floorboards and leaves the rest to the soft blue quiet of dusk. Past the orchard fence, fireflies stitch small, patient lights at the seam of the field. A moth turns a slow circle near the lamp and drifts away. The crickets keep their steady music, never hurrying, never late, just faithful to the hour. Somewhere down by the willow, the creek gathers its ribbon of sound and lays it thin and even under the chorus of the insects. The creek has a way of making time understandable. It tells you, without a clock, that the day is folding itself up and the dark is being spread like a blanket over the world. Samuel lifts the mug and feels the comfort move through his chest. Chamomile, a little honey, the memory of summer in it. flowers that opened when the sun was simple and the bees were busy in the white clover. He doesn't think about it much, but the taste always seems to bring back the same small picture. A patch of yellow behind the shed, his mother kneeling on the ground, thin gloves, a straw hat, the sound of her humming some tune with no name. She would say, "This one calms the evening," and smile without looking up, her voice made round and low by the hum of the insects and the softness of her breath. He can see the hat even now, hanging on its nail beside the kitchen door. The brim is bent, a little white dust of years upon the crown, but it keeps its shape the way old, reliable things do. He notices how the house holds these faithful objects without effort: the hat, the boots, the iron kettle with its smooth, dark handle, the berry-stained jars lying like short, patient soldiers on the shelf above the stove. The house does not show them off. It keeps them the way good memory keeps a story, quietly, honestly, without trying to make it more than it was. From the porch, he watches the last of the color burn down in the sky. It goes from gold to amber, then to the faintest purple, and finally to a deep, friendly blue. The first stars are not bright yet. They are shy at the edges, and he finds them by knowing where to look rather than by seeing them outright. He has learned this from years of evenings. When you wait with the field long enough, the field begins to speak to you in its own steady language. The swing sounds its small ceremony, a mild creak forward, a mild creak back. Between those sounds is a space that asks for nothing and offers rest. He thinks of how much of life happens in the space between things, the pause after a sentence, the span of breath between cup and mouth, the little stillness after the day's last chore is done. If he had to name what keeps a person steady, it might be those in-between places. They hold a person together without much notice. In the orchard, a late apple thuds once softly into the grass. It is not a sound of loss, it is a sound of belonging. Fruit returning to the ground that raised it. The trees are almost finished for the year. Their leaves have the dull shine of the season's last weeks, darker now, holding on to their green with a kind of quiet effort. The wind slides over them and sets a small conversation in motion. Leaf to leaf, bough to bough. The sound is like the rustle of pages in a known book. Samuel takes another sip and breathes with the swing. On the table beside him, a short, round table his father made from a leftover slice of oak. There is a simple cloth coaster, a pencil stub, and a small wooden box he does not open tonight. The box is not a secret. It is just a keeper of paper and small things that once had pockets, a button with a nick in it, a smooth gray stone from the river, a page torn from a seed catalog with a red circle around a variety of bean his mother liked best. He can feel their presence without lifting the lid. Sometimes knowing that a thing is there is the same as holding it. He sets the mug down and rests his palms flat on the swing slats. The boards have grown into the shape of his hands the way an old path grows to fit the feet that travel it. He does not need to grip. Nothing is pulling him. The house behind him is a quiet weight, the field a quiet length before him, and between the two he sits as if he were a bridge of breath joining them together. A distant dog offers a single bark and then thinks better of it. In the lane, gravel settles as the evening grows still. A little later, a pickup hums by, slow, respectful of the hour, its light sweeping the tips of the grass and laying a brief silver on the porch rail. The driver raises a hand, though Samuel is not sure the man can see him in the shadow. He raises his hand anyway, because courtesy is its own light, and it is good to keep such lights burning. He thinks of the narrow calendar pinned by the pantry door. Each square on it holds nothing more than a pencil mark. Plant potatoes, mend fence, call Mary about jars. Life, when written that way, looks small, but he's come to see how those small marks keep a person faithful to the living. They remind you that a day is made by a certain care, the care of putting your hands to a task, of cleaning them after, of setting things in their places, of standing on the porch at evening to see what the day did with you and what you did with it. The creek adds a little coolness to the air. He imagines its stones, the wide ones that press the water flat and the round ones that let it bubble up in a soft laugh. He remembers learning the trick of skipping stones on the farm pond, the side throw, the wrist, the way a flat stone wants to go true if you give it a fair start. These are not memories to make a person ache. They are the kind that make a person sigh and feel the length of himself, kindly. The lamp by the door hums a little and then quiets. The moth returns, finds the glass, and pauses, breathing its small, quick breath. He thinks, even a moth has its place in the order of the evening. The moth will live out its small purpose. The field will turn over into night. The trees will stand their posts, and he will finish his tea and let the swing be the keeper of his rest. He takes the mug again and notes the way the honey has drifted to the bottom. He gives it a slow turn, watches the thin golden thread rise and settle. A neighbor once said that honey carries the map of a season, the route of the bees, the flowers that opened, the weather that trained the blossom into sweetness. If that is true, then each cup is a small history, and each swallow returns a person to the meadow that made it possible. A coolness touches the skin at the back of his neck. He reaches for the old cardigan folded over the arm of the swing and draws it on. The wool is clean but holds the faint scent of the cedar chest. He remembers the chest being carried up the stairs when he was a boy. 2 uncles, breathy laughter, careful steps, his mother calling out, "Easy now," as if the wood were a living thing that might be startled. He smiles at the memory. In this place, wood has always been close to life. The boards underfoot, the table pale with sanded grain, the doors that open without complaint, the fence that gives a little but does not break. He places the empty mug on the coaster and folds his hands. There is nothing he needs to think about, and so his thoughts arrange themselves without him, like a drawer that knows where each tool belongs. He lets the evening do the arranging. It puts the larger matters at the back, where they will keep until morning, and brings forward what is needed now. Breath, weight, the quiet blessing of being held by a place that knows him. The stars have come a little closer. They show themselves in the gaps between the leaves. He counts 3, then 5, then loses track, which is better. Numbers are for the day. The night is for the shape of things, how they lean, how they join, how they promise to be here again tomorrow. He looks to the end of the porch where a broom rests in its corner. He remembers sweeping after supper, long strokes, porch to yard, pushing the dust and the dry leaves down the steps. His mother once told him that the world asks only this, that you tend it with steady hands and a decent heart. He has kept that sentence, polished it with use. It fits the way the handle of the broom fits his palm. The swing slows. He does not mind. A gentle slowing is a kind of wisdom in a day. The chains speak their small metal word and then hold their peace. The quiet that follows is not empty. It holds a welcome, like an old friend at your shoulder, who asks for nothing except that you sit together and listen to the wind. He closes his eyes for a breath or two, a light ache in his back, a practiced comfort in his shoulders, the familiar rest of his weight on the slats. These are the simple facts of having lived. He feels no need to rise and no urgency to sleep. He is somewhere in the middle, like the field between house and creek, like the shadow between dusk and night. The middle is enough. When he opens his eyes, the yard has settled. The grass is a darker band now. The fence is a steadier line. A faint mist is gathering low over the far corner of the field, and the willow looks older in the dimness, which suits it, old things like old light. He reaches for the small wooden box and lays his palm on the lid without lifting it. Not yet, he thinks, though there is no reason to wait. The evening, it seems, is asking only for his company, and he is content to give it. There will be time enough for paper and ink and the soft turning of pages. For now, the porch is page enough, and the night is telling its own good, steady story. The swing answers the wind once more, forward and back, forward and back. A breath, a pause, a breath, and the evening, patient as ever, widens its quiet to make room for sleep. The night had settled fully now, not the kind of night that comes suddenly, like a curtain being pulled across a window, but the slow, deliberate night that seeps in through the corners and edges, softening what the day has left behind. Samuel sat in the porch swing, his hands resting on his knees, his cardigan buttoned all the way up, feeling the air grow cooler in a way that didn't press, only embraced. The small wooden box on the table beside him had been sitting there since before the tea. He hadn't meant to open it tonight, but sometimes things ask to be opened without words, and the evening seemed to have that in mind. The box itself was not remarkable to anyone else's eyes, its corners worn smooth, its lid held by two small brass hinges dulled to the color of old honey. But Samuel knew every line of the grain, every mark left by time and touch. The oak had been cut from a tree on the property when he was a boy, carved and sanded by his father's hands in the workshop that used to stand where the shed is now. He ran a thumb slowly over the edge before lifting the lid. The hinges made no sound. They had been tended to over the years, oiled with care. Inside lay a scattering of paper and small keepsakes, things with little value except to the one who had carried them here and kept them safe. On top was an envelope, yellowed at the edges. Samuel knew the handwriting before he even picked it up. His mother's, rounded and steady, each letter shaped as if it mattered more than the one before. He held it in his palm for a moment before opening it. The letter inside was short, written on lined paper. It spoke of the weather that spring, how the rain had come a little early, how the lilacs by the kitchen window had bloomed all at once. She'd written about the first planting of the year, about the feel of the soil warming under her hands, and about how she hoped Samuel, then away working in town, was eating well and sleeping enough. He read it twice, not because the words were hard to understand, but because reading them once wasn't enough to feel their weight. There was no news in the letter that mattered to anyone but him. No events of consequence, no announcements, only the truth of a life told in small, ordinary moments. When he folded it back, he set it aside and looked deeper into the box. There was a ticket stub from a county fair, the print faded but still legible. August 14th, 1978. That had been the summer he took the old Ford into town for the fair. The same year he'd won second place in the pie-eating contest without meaning to. He could still remember the warm evening air thick with the scent of fried dough, the sound of the Ferris wheel turning slow and high above the fairground lights. Beneath that was a smooth, flat stone, the kind shaped perfectly to fit the curve of a palm. He'd found it at the creek when he was 12, skipping stones with his cousin Jacob. It had flown far, bouncing 3 times, before sinking, and he'd fished it back out later as if keeping it would keep the afternoon as well. Samuel smiled faintly, his hand curling around the stone now. It still carried the coolness of water in his mind. He could almost hear the creek again, the low, even run over the rocks, the bright splash of a kingfisher diving in the shallows. He'd walked those banks more times than he could count, boots sinking into the damp earth, willow branches brushing his shoulders as he passed. He let the stone rest back in the box and lifted out the next thing, a photograph. It was black and white, the edges soft and curling in. The picture showed the porch, this same porch, years ago. His father stood by the rail, 1 foot on the lower step, his cap pushed back on his head. His mother sat on the swing with a basket of green beans in her lap, her hands paused mid-shelling, smiling at whoever had taken the picture. The boards under their feet looked newer then, the paint still white and unbroken. But the feeling in the picture was the same as it was now. He set the photo down carefully and sat back in the swing, letting it carry him for a while. The chains creaked in their old rhythm, forward and back, forward and back. The night air brought the smell of damp earth from the orchard and a hint of wood smoke from somewhere down the road. The box sat open beside him, its contents unhurried. He didn't need to look through them all tonight. That wasn't the way of such things. You kept them so you could visit them as you needed, not to rush through them, but to let them find you when the time was right. A breeze touched the porch, light enough to stir the edges of the papers in the box, but not strong enough to disturb them. Samuel placed the letter, the ticket, the stone, and the photograph back in their places, closing the lid without hurry. He rested his palm on the closed box for a long moment. It wasn't sadness that held him there, nor longing exactly. It was something quieter, gratitude perhaps for the way these small pieces could hold the shape of years. The swing kept moving, the porch boards cool under his feet. The world beyond softened into shades of blue and gray. A single star shone brighter now in the sky, as if it had been waiting for this exact moment to appear. Samuel leaned back, drawing in a slow breath, letting it go just as slowly. The night didn't press in. It welcomed him, the way the swing welcomed his weight, the way the house had welcomed him home each evening for decades. There would be other nights for the box. For now, it was enough to know it was there, holding its quiet cargo of memory, while the swing rocked him gently and the dark laid its steady hand over the fields. And in that slow, certain rhythm, the rhythm of the swing, the crickets, and his own breathing, Samuel let the night take him, inch by inch, toward rest. The swing was still moving, forward and back in that steady rhythm, when Samuel's eyes drifted past the yard and into a place much farther away than the orchard fence. It was not the night he saw anymore, but a morning, one that had lived in him for decades, as vivid now as when it first happened. He was a boy again, no more than 10, and the summer light was already spilling wide across the yard. That light had a weight to it in those days, not heavy, but full of warmth, of scent, of sound. The dew clung to the grass in small bright beads, and if you walked barefoot, the wet would hold to your skin long after you'd crossed into the dry dust of the lane. The air carried the smell of honeysuckle from the fence line, mixing with the sharper green of mown hay drying in the sun. He could see himself thin and quick, pushing the swing hard enough that his toes scraped the dirt at the edge of the porch, then letting it carry him until the chains gave that pleasant jolt at the farthest point forward. The boards were warm from the early sun, and the sound of the chains was sharper in the morning. Bright and clear, the metal still cool before the heat of the day. From the kitchen came the sound of his mother moving about. Pans shifted on the stove, and he knew the smell that would follow before it even reached him. Biscuits in the oven, coffee percolating, the faint sweetness of blackberry jam opened on the counter. She would step out soon, apron tied at the waist, a glass of milk in her hand for him, calling him to wash up before breakfast. He remembered the way she looked in that light, her hair pinned back loosely, a little damp at the temples from the warm kitchen. Her voice was never hurried in the morning, even if there was work to be done. It was as if she believed the day would give her all the time she needed, and she moved as though that trust had always been repaid. In the yard, his father was already at the fence mending a loose post. The sound of the hammer striking metal was slow and measured, each pause as important as the swing itself. Every now and then his father would straighten, lean against the rail, and look out over the field, as if to check that it was still there, still growing as it should. He might nod once to no one in particular, then return to the post. That morning there had been a light breeze, enough to move the leaves in the big sycamore by the road, enough to set the laundry line swaying gently. White shirts and bed sheets billowed like sails, their shadows folding and unfolding on the grass. He remembered running through those shadows, the air cool under them, then hot again in the open sunlight. The swing in those days was new. His father had built it just the summer before, sanding the edges smooth so no splinter would find a child's hand. The paint was still fresh then, white as the clouds that drifted above the far hill, and when you pushed it high enough, you could see over the orchard and catch a glimpse of the creek flashing in the distance. It was a small magic, that view, a reward for the effort of swinging. He could still hear the bees in the clover, the slow cluck of hens in the pen, the occasional bark from the neighbor's dog. All these sounds layered into the morning like threads in a well-woven cloth, holding together without tangling. Nothing pressed, nothing demanded. It was the kind of day that seemed to have no edge, as if it could go on like that forever. Breakfast had been simple, biscuits split open and filled with jam, a slice of fried ham, milk cold enough to bead the glass. They'd eaten on the porch that day, his father setting his plate on the railing, while he talked about the weather, the pasture, the likelihood of rain by Thursday. His mother listened, shelling peas into a wide bowl, the sound of them dropping against the enamel like quiet notes in the air. Afterward, he had gone back to the swing, his legs pumping until the sky tilted forward and back above him. His father had left for the field, his mother returned to the kitchen, and he'd been left to the quiet company of the porch and the day itself. That was the moment he remembered most, the way the house seemed to breathe around him, the way the swing matched the slow beat of his heart, the way the light lay across the boards as if it had always belonged there. Now, sitting as an old man in the same place, he could feel that morning under his skin. The porch boards were different now, worn by years, their paint gone to gray, but they held the same warmth in summer and the same cool in the early hours. The orchard beyond was older, some trees replaced, others leaning, but in the right light, he could almost believe it was the same. Even the swing, its chains dulled, its wood bare, carried the memory of his smaller hands gripping the arms, of his bare feet tucked under the seat as he sailed forward. He thought about how the world had seemed so large then, and how it had grown smaller as he had learned its turns and edges. And yet, in another way, it had grown larger too, filled with the weight of moments like that morning, moments that did not diminish with time but deepened, like the grain in old wood. A faint smile touched his face. He wasn't trying to hold on to the past, not in the way of resisting change, but in the way of honoring it, keeping it alive through remembering. The past, after all, was not gone. It was here in the swing's slow creak, in the smell of the orchard, in the way the evening air wrapped around him now, not unlike the morning air of that long-ago summer. The night before him and the morning behind him seemed to fold together, like two sides of a blanket drawn close, and in that joining there was no need for hurry, no need to measure the years between. The swing moved on, forward and back, holding both the boy and the man, the morning and the night, in the same gentle rhythm. Samuel let his eyes drift to the orchard once more, the branches dark against the deepening sky. He thought of the boy he had been, barefoot and laughing, pushing hard toward that glimpse of the creek. And he thought of himself now, letting the wind do the pushing, content with the view as it was. Some things, he knew, were meant to be chased when you were young. Others were meant to be received when you were older. And the porch swing, faithful through it all, knew the difference. He breathed in the night air, breathed out the years, and let the swing carry him, just as it always had, without asking where he was going, only knowing he belonged. The night had deepened into that soft, unhurried darkness that seemed to come only in the countryside, where no city lights rushed to erase it. Samuel sat in the swing, the chain's rhythm so steady it was more like a heartbeat than a sound, when he caught a small flicker down the lane, warm, wavering, like the glow of a lantern. He leaned forward slightly, resting his forearms on his knees. The glow moved slowly, not with the restless motion of someone in a hurry, but with the measured pace of a person used to walking at night. It wasn't long before the shape behind the light became clear. Mary Ellsworth, his neighbor from 2 farms over, carrying her old oil lantern and wearing the same knitted shawl he had seen her in for years. Samuel knew Mary's walk before he knew her face in the light. There was a steadiness to it, a certain way her feet found the packed earth without looking, as if the road and her steps had been made to fit each other. He rose from the swing, set his hands in his pockets, and stepped to the edge of the porch. "Evening, Mary," he called, his voice low so it wouldn't feel like breaking the night apart. She lifted the lantern a little higher, the light catching in her eyes. "Evening, Sam," she answered, and the familiar sound of his name in her voice felt like a cup being set back in its proper place. Mary stopped at the gate, leaning her weight on it, the way people do when they mean to talk a while. He could see now that she carried a small basket, covered with a clean tea towel, in her other hand. "Thought you might could use these," she said, pushing the basket forward as he walked down the steps to meet her. He took it, the warmth of what was inside coming through the towel. "What have you brought me now?" he asked, already knowing from the smell that it was bread. She smiled, her cheeks catching the light from the lantern. "Just a couple of loaves, fresh out of the oven. I'd not be able to sleep if I kept them in the house. The smell would keep me up all night." He chuckled softly. "Then I'd say you came to the right place. I'll make sure they find a good home." For a moment they stood there at the gate, not speaking. The night filled the space for them. The crickets carried on with their chorus, and from somewhere deep in the orchard came the faint rustle of a possum moving through the grass. "You out here all evening?" she asked, tilting her head toward the swing. "Most of it," he replied. "Had the box out earlier. Just one of those nights where the past feels a little closer than usual." Mary nodded in the way of someone who understood without needing every detail explained. "Some nights are like that," she said. "The quiet pulls things forward." He thought about that for a moment, then smiled. "That's a good way to put it." They walked back toward the porch together. He stepped ahead to hold the basket in one arm while pulling out a chair for her near the swing. Mary sat, setting the lantern on the little table between them. Its light pooled over the wood, catching the grain in soft golds and browns and throwing gentle shadows over the porch rail. "I brought you some honey too," she said, gesturing to the basket. "From my hives this year. The bees worked hard, Sam, real hard. The clover was good to them." He lifted the jar from where it was nestled beside the bread. The honey was thick and deep in color, like bottled sunlight. "I'll save some of this for winter," he said, though he knew the first spoonful would go into tomorrow morning's tea. Mary leaned back, pulling her shawl closer around her shoulders. "Feels like the kind of night that makes you remember all the other nights just like it," she said quietly. Samuel nodded. "That's the thing about this place. It holds them all. Every evening, every voice, every sound. They never seem too far off." They sat without speaking for a while after that, letting the swing's steady motion and the night's soft sounds do the talking. Every so often, the lantern's flame would lean with the breeze, then settle back. From the far side of the field, a barn owl called once, its voice low and even, carrying over the grass. Mary smiled faintly. "Haven't heard one of those in a while," she said. "Not many left near here," Samuel replied, "but every now and then one comes by to remind us." Her eyes lingered on the dark line of the orchard. "Do you ever think about how much this land has seen? All the things we've done and all the things we never will?" "All the time," he said, "but I figure the land doesn't keep score. It just remembers in its own way." The conversation went no further than that, and it didn't need to. It was enough to share the air, the light, and the sound of the swing. When Mary finally rose to go, Samuel walked her back to the gate. The lantern cast their shadows long and thin across the ground. "You'll keep the bread warm tonight?" she asked, half smiling. "I'll do my best," he said, "and you get home safe. Let the night take its time with you." She nodded, lifting the lantern again as she made her way down the lane. He stood at the gate until the light grew small and the darkness filled the space again, the steady chorus of crickets closing around him like a familiar blanket. Back on the porch, he set the basket inside the doorway, then returned to the swing. The night was as it had been before she came, calm, patient, holding all the hours it had left to give. The smell of fresh bread lingered on his hands. He placed them on the armrests, feeling the smooth wood beneath his palms, and leaned back. The swing moved forward and back. The stars were brighter now, and Samuel thought, not for the first time, that a night shared, even in quiet, was twice as generous as one spent alone. When the lantern light had faded down the lane and the sound of Mary's steps no longer reached the porch, the night seemed to settle deeper, as if it had been holding its breath and could now exhale. Samuel eased himself back into the swing, the wooden slats taking his weight with the same easy welcome they had always given. The basket Mary had left sat just inside the door, but its presence filled the air between him and the house. The faint, warm scent of the bread drifted outward, mingling with the cooler breath of the orchard. It was a smell that didn't press forward. It simply arrived, like a remembered kindness. He thought about leaving it where it was until morning, but the pull of it was quiet and sure. He rose from the swing, his knees making their small, familiar protest, and stepped to the doorway. The basket was light in his hands, the tea towel still faintly warm. When he lifted the cloth, the 2 loaves looked back at him with the gentle sheen of crust just out of the oven. On the side, wrapped in brown paper, was a jar of honey Mary had mentioned. It caught the light from the lamp, and the deep amber inside seemed to glow from its own center. He turned it slowly, watching the slow shift of the liquid. It was thick, heavier than water, slower than oil, a small gravity of its own. Samuel carried the basket to the table beside the swing. He didn't need a knife for what he meant to do. Breaking bread by hand was a way of keeping the moment whole. The crust gave a soft crackle as he pulled one end apart, and the steam that rose was rich with the smell of yeast and wheat. He sat half on the table, tore a smaller piece from his share, and dipped it into the jar of honey. The first bite was slow, the bread still warm, the honey thick and sweet in a way that felt like sunlight on the tongue. It was the kind of taste that didn't shout but stayed, holding its place in the mouth and in the mind. He chewed without hurry, looking out toward the orchard, where the mist had begun to gather low among the trunks. Eating on the porch at night was different from eating at the table indoors. Inside, the walls held you. Outside, the night kept you company. He had always liked the way food tasted in the open air, as if the earth itself was part of the seasoning. Another piece of bread, another slow ribbon of honey spread with the back of the spoon. The bees that had made it were long at rest now, their hives settled in the dark, but their day's work had found its way here, to his hands, to this small moment. He thought about what Mary had said. The clover had been good this year, and how many such years had passed without anyone counting them. The swing moved as he ate, not with the rhythm of thought, but with the rhythm of breath. Forward and back, the chains giving their quiet sigh. In the orchard, something, perhaps a raccoon, shifted the grass, and the sound came through as a slow ripple. Beyond that, the night kept to its own music, the cricket steady, the creek low but certain in its path. When the bread was gone and the honey jar closed, Samuel sat with his hands folded loosely in his lap. The warmth in his stomach matched the warmth of the cardigan at his shoulders. He could feel both working through him in the same gentle way, steadying him without asking anything in return. On the far side of the porch, the broom leaned in its place. He remembered sweeping there earlier in the week, pushing the dust and dry leaves down the steps and into the yard. It was a chore, but never a burden. It was the kind of work that left a place better than it had been, and that was enough. The stars had multiplied while he'd been eating. They were not sharp tonight, but soft, as if wrapped in a thin cloth. He thought of how many nights they had looked down on this porch, how many faces they had seen here. His parents, his younger self, neighbors who had stopped by for a word or two before heading home. He reached for the jar of honey again, not to open it, but to hold it. The glass was cool now, but the weight of it was pleasing. It reminded him of mornings long past when his mother would set a jar just like this one on the breakfast table. the sun striking it through the kitchen window, turning it to gold. She would tell him, "It'll keep you strong through the day." And he had believed her without question. The porch held still around him. Even the swing had stopped, though he hadn't noticed when. He liked it that way sometimes. No movement, only the nearness of the house at his back and the nearness of the land before him. A low wind came from the west, carrying the scent of the creek and something faintly metallic, like the air before rain. It pressed gently against his face, then passed on, leaving the leaves in the orchard whispering to each other in its wake. Samuel leaned back, the honey jar still in his hands, and closed his eyes. The night was not asking him to sleep, not yet. It was simply asking him to stay. And he thought, sitting there with the taste of bread and honey still lingering, that staying might be the most important thing a man could do in a place like this. He set the jar down carefully, adjusted the cardigan at his shoulders, and let his head rest against the back of the swing. The stars, the field, the orchard, the quiet, each was in its place, and so was he. It was enough. The night was in no hurry to move along, and neither was Samuel. He sat in the swing, the jar of honey resting now on the small table beside him, the bread wrapped again under its towel, and let his eyes wander out toward the orchard. The mist was thicker now, low and silver in the lantern's faint reach, pooling at the bases of the apple trees like a blanket the earth had pulled up against the chill. The shapes of the branches blurred into one another, and the far rows disappeared into the soft dark. It was the sort of view that made the mind drift back, drift deep, until he was no longer seeing the orchard as it was tonight, but as it had been on a morning many years ago, in the season when the air was alive with the smell of apples ready to be taken in. He could almost hear the sound before he saw it, the thump of apples falling into baskets, the gentle scrape of a ladder shifting against bark, the rustle of branches letting go of their weight. It had been early, the kind of morning when the grass is wet enough to darken the cuffs of your pants, and the light comes sideways through the trees, turning the air gold in places. His father had been there, already halfway through the second row, when Samuel came down from the house, still pulling his sweater over his head. "Morning," his father had called, not pausing in his work. "Best light of the day, let's use it." There was truth in that. The mornings held a crispness that made the apples easier to handle, their skins cool and firm under the fingers, the stems snapping clean from the branch with a small, satisfying sound. Samuel remembered the feel of the wooden picking basket against his hip, the way it would grow heavier as the row went on. Some apples would still be marked from summer storms, their surfaces dimpled or scratched, but his mother would keep those for pies and sauce. The good ones, the perfect ones, would be set aside for sale or for careful storing in the cool back room of the cellar, where the air smelled faintly of earth and sweetness for weeks. The work was quiet, broken only by the occasional voice. His father pointing out a good cluster high up, his mother reminding him not to bruise the fruit by dropping it in too hard. Mostly, though, it was the sound of the orchard itself, the leaves whispering in the light breeze, the dull thump of an apple into the basket, the creak of the ladder as someone shifted their weight. At midday, they would rest on the grass at the edge of the field, backs against the trunks, eating bread with sharp cheddar and slices of apple so fresh they still held the morning's coolness. Those breaks were as much a part of the work as the picking itself. They gave space for the body to notice the good of the day, to feel the ache in the shoulders and the warmth of the sun, to let the eyes wander up into the branches where patches of sky peered through. Once, that day, he'd lain back fully, looking up past the dark leaves to where a single apple hung against the blue. It had swayed slightly, catching the light until it seemed almost to glow. He'd thought then, without knowing why, that this was what it meant for something to be ready, to hold all it could until the right moment, and then to let go. The harvest had gone on into the afternoon, the baskets lined up in the shade in neat rows, each one carrying its quiet weight. By the time they finished, the sun was low, and the orchard smelled of warm wood, fallen leaves, and the faint tang of juice where a few apples had split on the ground. They'd carried the baskets to the wagon, each trip leaving the rows a little emptier, a little more open to the coming winter light. Sitting on the swing now, Samuel could feel all of it, the heft of the basket, the bend of the branches, the way the day itself seemed to lean toward the gathering. He thought of his father's hands, how they would turn each apple gently before setting it in place, as if every one were meant for a special table. He thought of his mother's apron pockets full of smaller fruit she would later slice thin and dry for winter. The memory didn't ache, it rested in him, the way the orchard rested under tonight's mist. He knew those days were gone, that the harvests now were smaller, quieter, sometimes only enough for himself and a few neighbors. But the rhythm of it, the season turning, the trees offering, the hands receiving, had not left. It was here, in the way the branches shifted when the wind passed through, in the smell of the earth when the air cooled, in the patient way the land waited for a person to notice it. From the porch, the present and the past seemed to sit together without conflict. The trees in the mist and the trees in the morning light of his memory were not at odds. They were part of the same long story, one that didn't need to be told all at once. Samuel let the swing move slowly, as if rocking both times in the same motion. Somewhere in the dark, a single apple fell. The sound was soft, muffled by grass, but it carried clearly to him. He smiled, thinking how even now the orchard gave its small reminders. It would not be harvest tomorrow or the next day, but the work was already beginning in quiet ways. The night, like the orchard, had no need to rush, and so he stayed there, hands resting on the worn wood of the swing, watching the mist, breathing the air that still held a faint trace of apples, letting the memory of that long ago morning settle beside him as easily as a neighbor in an empty chair. The stars brightened overhead and the swing carried on, forward and back, holding him in the same steady rhythm that had carried the weight of apples, the light of mornings, and the quiet grace of years. The mist that had been resting low among the apple trees began to shift. Samuel noticed it first in the faint change of sound, the smallest hush of leaves, as if they were bracing for something gentle. Then came the scent, that cool metallic edge in the air that told of rain before a single drop had fallen. He leaned back in the swing, drawing the cardigan closer around his shoulders. The night had been still for so long that the promise of rain felt like a quiet guest approaching the porch, respectful, unhurried. The first drops came lightly, barely audible except for the softest tapping on the porch roof. He glanced out toward the orchard, where the dark shapes of the trees seemed to blur even more as the rain began to draw its thin curtain between them. Each drop on the leaves made a sound like the smallest coin being placed in an unseen jar. Soft, deliberate, certain. The swing moved with him as he shifted to set his feet up on the low rail, letting the night's coolness find his hands. The rain had a way of settling him deeper, as though its steady rhythm seeped into the wood beneath him, into the very timbers of the house. It was not a storm, not even what one might call a shower, just a patient, easy fall, the kind that could last for hours without raising its voice. In the half light from the porch lamp, he could see the wet gleam forming on the boards. It was the kind of shine that carried memory with it. He thought of all the other nights he had sat here and watched the rain do this exact thing, spread out in slow patterns, darkening the wood, making the air heavy with the smell of earth and grain and old timber. The sound from the orchard deepened as the rain grew a little steadier. Water on leaves has its own language, and Samuel had learned to hear its differences. The high, thin tapping on young leaves, the deeper, fuller patter on the wide, mature ones, the occasional hollow note when a drop landed on fallen fruit. It was a conversation you didn't need to answer, only to receive. He rested his head against the back of the swing and closed his eyes. Behind the gentle percussion of the rain, there was the steady undercurrent of the creek, now changing its tune slightly as the runoff began to reach it. That layered sound, the rain above, the water below, had a way of pulling the mind toward quiet places, toward the spaces in memory where time slowed to match the weather. He remembered, without meaning to, a night from his boyhood when the rain had been just like this. He'd been small enough then that his feet couldn't quite touch the porch floor from the swing. His mother had been beside him, knitting in her lap, her needles clicking softly in time with the drops overhead. Every so often she would pause to look out into the rain, not to judge its worth for the crops or the garden, but simply to see it, like someone appreciating a song they already knew by heart. That night she had told him that rain at night was a kind of blessing you didn't have to work for. You didn't plant it, you didn't harvest it, you only let it come, and it would do what it was meant to do. Even now, decades later, those words felt true in ways he couldn't quite explain. The bread in the basket was still warm enough to release its faint aroma into the air near the doorway, and it mixed with the smell of rain in a way that made him feel entirely held. He considered pouring himself a small glass of milk to go with another slice, but decided against leaving the swing just yet. Moments like this were not to be broken by movement unless they asked for it. A breeze came through, cool and smelling of wet grass. It set the rain to slanting slightly, tapping the porch rail before the drops slid down to the boards. The lantern's flame flickered in response, making the shadows of the porch post sway like slow dancers. From somewhere near the fence line came the soft bleat of a sheep, one of Mary's flock, likely unsettled by the change in weather. The sound was brief, almost questioning, then faded back into the rain's steady hush. Samuel thought about how rain at night seemed to belong to no one in particular. It was not claimed by the working hours of the day, nor tied to any chore. It was free to be entirely itself, quiet, persistent, nourishing in ways you couldn't measure just by looking. He reached for the honey jar, not to open it, but to hold it in his lap. The rain had a way of making objects feel more alive. Glass cooler, wood softer, cloth warmer to the touch. He turned the jar slowly, watching the way the light caught the amber within, deepening it to bronze, then lightening it again. The swing creaked forward, back, forward, back. The rain carried on, unhurried, and in that layered soundscape, Samuel felt the day's edges dissolve entirely. There was no before, no after, only this. The rain on the roof, the orchard drinking in the quiet water, the steady presence of the house around him. He imagined for a moment that the rain was telling the trees a story. not one of drama or urgency, but of patience, of how a thing can grow without showing all its work at once. And perhaps the trees were answering, their leaves giving back 1,000 soft notes of agreement. Samuel breathed in deeply, the air damp and cool in his lungs, and let the swing carry him just a little farther back. The motion was as slow as the rain itself, and just as steady. If someone had been walking by on the road at that moment, they might have seen only a man on a porch, cradling a jar of honey and listening to the rain. But Samuel knew it was more than that. It was the holding of a night that asked for nothing but his company, the kind of night that would be remembered not for what happened, but for how it felt to be in it. The rain eased for a moment, then returned, as if reminding him it was in no hurry to leave, and neither was he. The night's rain had left the world with a certain stillness, the kind that comes only after the earth has been given exactly what it needed. When Samuel woke, it was to the softened light of a sky still half covered in pale cloud, the air through the open window smelling of wet grass and clean soil. The sound of the rain was gone, replaced by the distant call of a mourning dove, its slow, deliberate notes settling into the corners of the morning. He lay there for a while, not in any rush to leave the bed. The sheets held the faint coolness of the night, and from where he was, he could see the top branches of the orchard, their leaves catching the muted light in quiet flashes. The rain had rinsed the dust from them, leaving a green so deep it felt almost new. When he finally swung his legs over the side and sat up, he did so without hurry. The day would come whether he met it quickly or slowly, and he had learned the value of the latter. He dressed in his usual way, soft shirt, worn trousers, the cardigan still holding the faint scent of cedar from the chest, and stepped out onto the porch. The boards beneath his feet were damp, darkened to a richer shade, but no longer slick. Drops clung to the railings and to the chains of the swing, gathering until they fell with a single deliberate motion to the ground below. He rested a hand on the swing's back as he passed, feeling the coolness of the wood. The air was thick with the scent of the orchard, apples and wet leaves, a touch of moss from the fence posts, and the faint sweetness of blossoms left by the late blooming wildflowers along the edges. Each breath seemed to settle deeper in his chest than usual, as if the air itself carried a kind of quiet nourishment. The yard looked different after rain. The grass stood taller, the soil darker, the stones along the path cleaner in their outlines. Spiderwebs along the fence sparkled faintly, strung with pearls of water that trembled but did not fall. He walked slowly down the steps, his boots leaving faint impressions in the damp earth, and paused to take in the view. The orchard stretched before him, each tree distinct now in the softened light. Some of the apples had fallen during the night, resting in the grass with the sheen of rain still on their skins. He stooped to pick one up, turning it in his hand. It was firm and cool, the kind that would bite clean and crisp. For now, though, he simply placed it in the basket by the steps, a habit born from years of gathering the fruit before it could bruise in the grass. As he moved among the trees, his steps were cushioned by the damp earth. Birdsong came in scattered notes, sparrows busy in the low branches, a robin turning the soil near the roots for worms brought to the surface by the rain. Every so often, a drop of water would fall from above, landing on his shoulder or hat, and he would smile at the reminder that the trees were still releasing the night's gift. The orchard had a way of holding on to the rain, stretching its presence into the day that followed. The leaves glistened and the air beneath the branches felt like stepping into another room. cooler, dimmer, filled with a quiet that was not emptiness, but a patient waiting. By the time he reached the far row, the clouds were beginning to part in places, letting thin shafts of sunlight touch the tops of the trees. Where the light met the wet leaves, the green deepened, and tiny points of brightness appeared like sparks. It was in such small details that Samuel found the greatest comfort, how the world could be both still and alive at once. He paused by the old bench under the largest apple tree. It had been there for as long as he could remember, its planks weathered and gray, its legs settled firmly into the earth. Many times in years past he'd sat there with a basket beside him, pausing from the work to sip water or simply watch the wind move through the branches. Today he sat again, not for rest, but to let the morning speak. The smell of wet bark rose from the tree, mingling with the faint tang of apples above him. Somewhere nearby, the slow drip of water into a small puddle marked the passing seconds. From his seat, he could see the porch in the distance, the swing just visible between the posts. It struck him that the swing and the bench were like bookends to his days, one holding the quiet of the evening, the other the freshness of the morning. Between them lay the orchard, the grass, the work, and the waiting. He sat until the sun began to push through more fully, warming his hands. Then, with a small nod to the tree, as though acknowledging a shared understanding, he stood and began the walk back toward the house. His boots left no real path in the grass. The land had a way of taking back its shape after each step. On the porch again, he placed the basket with the single apple on the table beside the swing. The bread from Mary sat where he'd left it the night before, now cool but no less inviting. He cut a thick slice, drizzled it with a spoonful of honey, and sat in the swing to eat, watching the light gather in the orchard. The morning after the rain had a different kind of silence than the night before it. It wasn't the hush of rest, but the calm of renewal. Everything seemed to have taken a deep breath in the dark hours, and was now holding it gently, as if not wanting to lose the feeling too quickly. Samuel took a bite of bread, the honey warm on his tongue from the rising sun, and let the swing move in its slow arc. The day ahead was open, but there was no call to fill it just yet. Some mornings were meant only to be witnessed, to be carried quietly until night returned, and this, he thought, was one of them. The bread and honey sat warmly in Samuel's stomach when he decided it was time to move a little. The rain had left small gifts scattered about, the kind of quiet disorder that follows even the gentlest storm. Leaves pressed flat against the porch boards, twigs tucked in corners where the wind had dropped them, a thin line of mud along the edge of the steps. It wasn't much, but enough to call for the broom. The broom stood in its place at the far end of the porch, bristles slightly splayed from years of use. He'd had it so long that the handle bore the smoothness of his own grip, the wood shaped by the repetition of his hands. It was a tool without ceremony, but it carried the history of countless mornings like this. After rain, after wind, after the slow drift of autumn leaves, Samuel took it in his hands and began at the top step, pushing the damp leaves into small piles. The boards were cool beneath his boots, the air still carrying that mingling of earth and wood that only comes after rain. Each sweep made its own soft sound, bristles against grain, steady and unhurried. It was a rhythm that did not ask for thought, it made room for it instead. As he worked, his eyes followed the small details of the morning, a bead of water slipping down the swing's chain, catching sunlight in its curve before falling. the shadow of the railing stretching across the boards, thin at the top and wide at the base. A single ant navigating the edge of a puddle, finding a dry path to the other side. He paused now and then to look out over the yard. The orchard was brighter now, the sun breaking more confidently through the thinning clouds. Each leaf seemed outlined in light, and the wet grass shone in places where it had been pressed flat by his boots earlier. From somewhere near the lane came the slow hum of a tractor, distant enough to sound almost like a low bee in the air. It was the kind of sound that folded itself into the morning rather than interrupting it, the kind of sound that made you feel, without looking, that someone else was also starting their day with a simple task. He swept along the length of the porch, pausing by the table where the basket still held Mary's bread. The sight of it made him smile again, its presence like a kind word left behind in a room. He thought briefly of walking it over to her later in the day, returning the basket, perhaps with a jar of applesauce from the cellar. The thought stayed with him as he worked, not as an obligation, but as a small exchange of care between neighbors. The piles of leaves grew, each one a little bundle of color, gold, brown, the deep red of the maple by the fence. He carried them down the steps and scattered them at the edge of the yards, where they would break down into the soil in their own time. It pleased him to think that even in their falling, the leaves had another purpose to serve. When he reached the far end of the porch, Samuel leaned the broom against the railing and rested for a moment. From here, he could see the orchard more fully, the farthest rows still softened by the last traces of mist. A bluebird flitted from one low branch to another, pausing to tilt its head toward the ground before moving on. He thought of the many mornings he had done this same work. The seasons had passed over the boards beneath his feet. Summer heat, autumn's leaf fall, winter's frost, spring's first rains, and the act of sweeping had been the same through them all. It was not just about tidying the porch, it was a way of keeping pace with the place itself, of meeting each day halfway. He picked up the broom again, making his way back toward the steps with slow, deliberate strokes. The porch boards, now free of leaves and twigs, seemed to breathe a little easier, their grain dark and clean from the rain. The swing, too, had caught a few stray leaves between its slats, and he brushed them away with the back of his hand before setting the broom aside. Samuel sat down, the wood still cool against his palms. The air had shifted again, the sun now touching the orchard in wide swaths, the dampness beginning to lift from the yard. The smell of rain lingered, though, mixed now with the faint warmth of the sun on the boards. He leaned back, letting the swing take his weight, and listened. The tractor had gone quiet, replaced by the occasional call of a jay from somewhere in the distance. The morning was moving forward in its own time, and he was content to let it. Sweeping the porch had never felt like a chore to him. It was, in a way, a conversation between himself and the place, between what the night had left and what the day was beginning to offer. He thought of his father doing the same work, the same measured strokes, the same pause to lean on the handle and look out over the yard. The house, the porch, the orchard, they all seemed to hold those gestures, to remember them, even when no one else was there to see. And Samuel, feeling the weight of that continuity, knew he was simply adding his own chapter to the long, quiet record of mornings here. The bread would keep until midday, the honey would keep even longer, but the morning, this morning, after rain, would not come again in quite the same way. So he let the swing rock gently, his hands resting easy on the worn wood, and kept his eyes on the orchard, where the light was still finding its way through the last of the mist. It was, he thought, enough to have done this small work, to have met the day with something steady and kind. And with that thought, the porch, the swing, and the morning seemed to settle together, each holding its place in the simple, enduring rhythm of the farm. The broom leaned once more against its corner, its bristles drying slowly in the soft warmth. Samuel stood for a while on the porch, looking out over the yard he had just tended, feeling the air shift from the cool dampness of morning toward the gentler warmth of midday. The sun had climbed past the low orchard branches now, laying light across the roof of the shed and sending long shadows from the fence posts down toward the lane. He thought it might be time for another cup of tea, not the quick, bracing kind you make to begin a day, but the sort meant to be sipped without hurry, with the company of a slow hour. So he stepped inside, letting the screen door close behind him with its familiar wooden click. The kitchen greeted him with the stillness that held the faint traces of the morning. Bread on the counter under a folded cloth, a clean cup in the drying rack, the last curl of steam from the kettle's earlier use gone from the air. Sunlight fell in a bright square across the far end of the table, catching in the grain of the wood and the dust motes that drifted there like small, lazy swimmers. The smell of the room was a mix of fresh bread, faintly damp wool from his cardigan, and the clean scent of the rain that had slipped in through the open window over the sink. Samuel filled the kettle and set it on the stove, the hollow ring of metal on metal echoing gently through the room. He reached for the tin of tea, loose leaf, the same blend he'd been using for years, and took a moment to breathe in its dry, grassy scent before spooning it into the strainer. While the kettle began its low murmur, he leaned against the counter, letting his eyes wander out the window to the yard. The orchard from here looked almost like a painting, each tree distinct yet part of the same whole. He could see the damp sheen still clinging to some of the upper branches in the way the sunlight caught the beads of water on the fence wire. A bluebird landed on the post nearest the kitchen, turning its head one way and then the other, as if surveying the morning's changes before flitting off again. When the kettle gave its gentle whistle, Samuel poured the water over the tea and watched the steam rise, curling into itself before drifting toward the window. The scent spread quickly, warm and grounding. He set the strainer aside after a few minutes, preferring the tea strong enough to hold its own, but not so long steeped that it lost its gentleness. Carrying the cup to the table, he chose the chair nearest the window so he could keep an eye on the light outside. The sun was doing that late morning thing he liked, where it seemed to soften at the edges as it reached toward noon, laying a golden calm over everything it touched. On the table beside his tea, he placed a small plate with another slice of Mary's bread. This one lightly toasted, the heat brought out its scent again, mingling with the tea until the whole room seemed wrapped in something both simple and complete. He ate slowly, the crunch of the crust and the soft center filling the quiet in a way that didn't disturb it. Between bites, he sipped his tea, feeling its warmth spread through him. Outside, the breeze stirred just enough to shift the leaves in the nearest tree, making the light dance across the grass. Somewhere in the distance, the low rumble of a neighbor's truck passed along the lane, fading until the only sound left was the gentle clink of his spoon against the cup. These midday hours were never rushed here. The work that needed doing could wait for the turn of the day. The land seemed to understand that a man could not go from one task to the next without pausing to let the hours breathe. He thought as he sat there about how many times this kitchen had held such a pause. His mother at this very table, mending a shirt with the soft scratch of needle through fabric. His father coming in from the field, sitting heavily in the chair by the window, his hat set down with a small puff of dust beside it. Even on days when the work was pressing, there was always this moment in the middle, like the calm water in the center of a slow river. The tea cooled slightly as he lingered, and he drank the last of it without hurry. He set the empty cup in the sink, rinsing it under the cold water that ran clear and quick from the tap, and left it to dry on the rack. Before stepping back outside, Samuel stood for a moment at the kitchen door, looking out through the screen. The porch lay in dappled light now, the swing's chains glinting faintly each time the breeze shifted them. The orchard beyond seemed both near and far, its quiet unchanged since he had last been among the trees. The day ahead was still wide open. There would be time for tending the garden beds, for checking the fence along the lane, perhaps for walking down to the creek before supper. But for now, the kitchen and the porch between them held him, as they always had, in that familiar rhythm of movement and rest, work and pause. When he finally stepped back outside, cup in hand for another slow refill. Later, the light felt a little warmer on his skin. He walked to the swing, setting the cup down on the table beside it, and lowered himself into the seat. The boards underfoot were dry in places now, pale where the sun had touched them. The swing began its gentle motion again, forward and back as if it had been waiting for him to return. And Samuel, with the taste of tea still lingering and the midday light folding itself across the yard, let the day hold him exactly where he was, between what had been done and what was still to come. In the safe and steady heart of the farm's long, unhurried hours, the tea had left a pleasant warmth in Samuel's chest, a slow, steady comfort that seemed to match the calm of the day. From the swing, his eyes wandered past the orchard toward the smaller garden tucked against the south side of the house. It wasn't large, just a few raised beds and a narrow strip along the fence, but it held enough to keep a man busy if he wanted it to. He rose from the swing, leaving the empty cup on the table, and made his way down the steps. The yard met him with the soft give of damp soil beneath his boots. The rain from the night before had left the grass greener, fuller, as though it had been quietly mended while he slept. The garden waited in its familiar quiet, the air there warmer from the shelter of the fence and the way the midday sun had begun to collect against it. The scent was a mix of tomato vines, damp earth, and the faint sharpness of marigold blossoms planted at the corners to keep pests away. He stepped between the beds, moving with the same slow pace he always did here, partly from habit, partly from the understanding that the garden didn't ask for hurry. The first bed held the tomato plants, their stems thick and leaves broad from the season's growth. The rain had coaxed them into a deeper green overnight, and here and there a small yellow flower marked where fruit would soon form. One plant had bent slightly under the weight of its own promise, and Samuel crouched to tie it gently to its stake with the strip of soft cloth. Further along, the beans had climbed nearly to the top of their poles, their vines winding in a way that seemed both deliberate and effortless. He brushed a few drops of water from their leaves, watching them slide to the soil below. The sound was so small it could barely be called a sound at all, more a feeling of the air changing around him. A row of carrots showed only their frilled tops for now, the orange roots still hidden. He ran his hand lightly over the leaves, not to pull them, but simply to feel their cool texture against his skin. Gardens, he thought, held their own kind of patience, never showing everything at once, always keeping a little in reserve until the time was right. At the far end, near the fence, a few weeds had found their way between the lettuces. Samuel knelt and eased them out, careful to disturb as little soil as possible. The work was light, but it carried the same quiet satisfaction as sweeping the porch earlier that morning. A small act of tending, of keeping order without force. The lettuces themselves looked well, their leaves wide and open, holding drops of water like small glass beads. He thought about how, in a few weeks, he might bring a head or two to Mary, along with the applesauce he'd considered yesterday. Such exchanges were a kind of conversation, too, one made not with words, but with the steady give and take of neighborly hands. When the weeds were cleared, Samuel sat back on his heels for a moment. The sun had warmed the back of his neck, and a faint breeze moved across the garden, stirring the taller plants first and then passing lightly over the lower leaves. Somewhere nearby, a honeybee moved from bloom to bloom, its low hum adding to the layered quiet of the afternoon. He remembered other summers, other gardens, his father showing him how to plant in straight rows, his mother gathering beans in a wide apron until it was full enough to carry inside. The tools they had used then, wooden-handled, heavy, reliable, still hung in the shed, their grips worn smooth by years of hands. Working here now felt less like tending a new garden, and more like continuing one that had been handed to him. A cloud drifted across the sun, softening the light for a few minutes. Samuel leaned against the fence, resting his arms along the top rail, and looked back toward the house. From here, the porch looked smaller, the swing just a shadow between the posts, but it seemed to watch over the garden the way the garden watched over the yard. The cloud passed and the light returned, catching on the edges of the marigolds. He picked one that had grown too close to the lettuce and set it aside, thinking it would look well in the small vase on the kitchen table. It was a habit his mother had kept, bringing a bit of the garden inside, even if it was only one flower, to remind herself that the outside was never far away. By the time Samuel finished his small tasks, tying the tomato vine, brushing the leaves, clearing the weeds, the garden looked almost the same as when he had arrived, and that, he thought, was as it should be. Gardening was less about changing a place and more about meeting it where it was, leaving it ready for what would come next. He dusted his hands on his trousers and took a last look along the rows. The plants stood quiet, as if settling back into themselves after his visit. The air above them shimmered faintly in the sun, carrying the mixed scents of soil, green leaves, and the faint sweetness of the marigolds. Walking back toward the house, Samuel felt the kind of light tiredness that came from doing just enough work to remind the body it was useful. The swing waited on the porch, and beyond it, the orchard stretched into the day's deeper light. He would sit there again soon, perhaps with another cup of tea, perhaps with nothing at all in his hands. For now, the garden had been tended, the midday hours were still open, and the farm lay in its familiar rhythm, one small act of care following another, each carrying the same quiet weight, and in that steadiness, he felt the day hold together, as if the porch, the garden, and the orchard were all part of the same breath, moving gently in and out under the long, unbroken sky. The porch boards gave a small sigh beneath Samuel's boots as he stepped back up from the garden. The sun had shifted while he was among the rows, and now the shadows from the posts fell longer across the floor. He eased himself onto the swing, its wooden slats warm from the light, and felt the seat take his weight as though it had been waiting all morning for this moment. The swing moved with that same slow, familiar arc, forward just enough to see the yard stretch out toward the orchard, back just enough to bring the house into the corner of his sight again. From here, the smell of the marigold he had carried from the garden reached him, faint but steady, its color still bright against the pale wood of the small table beside him. Samuel leaned back, letting one hand rest along the worn arm of the swing. The air was different now, carrying the heat of the day, but softened by the faintest edge of breeze. It passed over his face like a quiet greeting, as though the day itself were content to let him sit without asking for anything in return. From somewhere in the orchard, the rustle of leaves broke the stillness, followed by the small thud of an apple dropping to the grass. It was such a gentle sound that it stirred something in him, not an urgency, but a kind of recognition. That was how the past often came to him these days, not in great waves, but in small, almost invisible ripples, set off by a sound or a light or a shift in the air. He thought then of Henry, an old friend from years back, one of the few people who had known this farm almost as well as Samuel himself. Henry had a way with gardens that wasn't learned so much as lived. He could tell the health of a plant by the tilt of its leaves, the way its stem held itself in the morning sun. They used to spend whole afternoons out by the fence line, patching wire or setting posts, their talk unhurried and broken by long stretches of companionable silence. Sometimes they'd pause to lean on their tools, looking out over the rows they had just finished, not to admire the work exactly, but to let it settle into place. The land always looked different after it had been tended, like it had exhaled. Samuel could picture him even now, walking up the lane with his hat pulled low, carrying a spade or a coil of twine. Henry's hands were broad, the nails always edged with soil, and his boots bore the marks of seasons' worth of rain and sun. He wasn't a man to rush through anything, not planning, not conversation, not the slow business of living in a place long enough to know its patterns. There had been one summer, years ago, when they worked together on a small patch of tomatoes near the orchard. The days had been hot, the air thick with the scent of ripening fruit, and they had taken to sitting on the porch after the work was done, drinking water from old glass bottles and letting the evening settle in around them. It was in those moments, Samuel thought, that the truest kind of friendship lived, not in grand gestures, but in the steady presence of another soul who understood the same quiet joys. Henry was gone now, had been for some years, but the farm still held his presence in ways Samuel could not quite name. A fence post here, still standing straight because Henry had set it deep. A row of raspberry canes at the far edge of the yard, planted on a morning when the rain had been just light enough to keep working through. Even the worn handle of the garden spade leaned in the shed, as if waiting for him to come back and take it up. Samuel found himself smiling at the thought, not with sadness exactly, but with the warmth of knowing that some people never really leave a place once they've worked their way into it. The land remembers, and in its own way, it keeps telling their story. The swing creaked softly as he shifted, and the sound joined the rest of the afternoon's quiet. Bird song from somewhere beyond the fence, the far-off murmur of a tractor in another field, the steady hum of summer insects. It struck him how much these sounds had been the backdrop to his life, the same as they had been for Henry. The rhythm of them had a way of carrying a man, even when the years themselves seemed to move too quickly. He reached over to touch the marigold on the table, turning it slightly so the sun caught its petals. It was a small thing, but it felt like the right kind of offering to the day, to the memory, to the place that had held both men's footsteps for so long. In the stillness, Samuel could almost hear Henry's voice again, low, unhurried, carrying a trace of the dry humor that had a way of showing itself only when it mattered. Perhaps it was just the breeze moving through the orchard, or perhaps it was something else. Either way, Samuel let the sound settle into him, the way the garden soil settled after a rain, filling every space until it felt whole again. The swing moved on, slow and steady. The day still held its light, and the hours ahead would unfold the way they always had here, one moment flowing quietly into the next, each carrying its own weight of memory and care. And Samuel, with the marigold bright at his side and the porch holding him in its steady wooden arms, felt no need to be anywhere else. The farm, the friend, the years, they were all still here, woven into the same gentle fabric that the afternoon seemed content to lay across his shoulders. The afternoon had begun its slow tilt toward evening when Samuel rose from the swing. The light had changed, still warm, but carrying that softer edge that hinted at the coming dusk. Shadows stretched longer across the yard, and the orchard seemed to hold a deeper shade of green now, as if the trees were gathering themselves for night. He stepped down from the porch with no particular destination in mind, though his feet seemed to know the way before he did. Past the garden, beyond the orchard, a narrow path wound toward the edge of the property. It was not a road so much as a memory of one, a strip of grass kept short by nothing more than his own walking over it through the years. The air grew cooler as he moved away from the house. He could hear the faint trickle of water even before the trees appeared ahead, the small creek that marked the far boundary of his land. It wasn't much to look at, no more than a few feet wide in most places, but it had been there longer than the fence lines, longer than the orchard, longer even than the house itself. Samuel had known it since he was a boy. He remembered running down here with Henry on summer evenings, fishing poles in hand, the smell of damp leaves rising as they pushed through the undergrowth. They had caught more minnows than trout in those days, but the measure of their trips had never been in what they brought back. It was in the quiet hours spent side by side, the water sliding over smooth stones, the low murmur of the forest folding itself around them. As he came to the edge of the orchard, the grass gave way to the cooler hush of the woods. The canopy overhead filtered the sunlight into a shifting patchwork on the ground, and each step seemed to stir the scent of pine and earth. A few birds moved in the branches above, their calls carrying easily in the stillness. He slowed his pace without thinking. In places like this, hurrying always felt wrong, like speaking too loudly in a room meant for listening. The path bent gently to the right, and there ahead the creek caught the light in small, bright flashes. Samuel stopped where the bank sloped gently toward the water. It was much as he remembered from boyhood, the same curve where the current eased, the same cluster of stones that broke the flow into a soft ripple. He could almost see two boys crouched there, sleeves rolled up, faces intent on some small movement in the shallows. The memory of it came without ache, only a kind of fullness, as though those days still lived quietly somewhere in the air. He knelt and let his hand drift into the water. It was cool, the kind of cool that carried with it the scent of rain from some far-off place upstream. He stayed like that for a while, the water slipping past his fingers. Above him, a single shaft of light had found its way through the trees, striking the moss on the far bank. The green there was so deep it seemed to hold its own light, a color untouched by the dust and glare of the open fields. Samuel thought of the times he and Henry had come here late in the day, when the sun was already low and the shadows stretched across the creek. They would sit on the bank with their lines in the water, not expecting to catch much, talking in the way boys talk when they have more time than they can use. There had been something in those evenings, a quiet that didn't need to be filled, a sense that the world beyond the trees could wait until they were ready to meet it again. The breeze shifted, bringing with it the faint scent of wood smoke from somewhere beyond his land. It mingled with the smell of the creek and the pine, creating that layered fragrance he had always thought of as autumn's first whisper. Though the season was still weeks away, the air seemed to be practicing for it. Cooler here, softer there, the light lingering in a way that felt both generous and fleeting. He rose slowly, brushing his hand against his trousers, and walked along the bank for a few paces. The path here was less defined, but his boots found it easily enough. Every so often he'd pause to watch the way the current moved around a stone or how a fallen leaf turned slowly in the eddy before drifting on. At a bend in the creek, Samuel stopped again. From this spot, the water widened into a still pool before narrowing once more. It had been one of Henry's favorite places to cast a line, something about the way the fish liked to rest there before moving on. Samuel could see him in his mind's eye, standing with the easy patience of someone who knew the fish would come in their own time. The thought brought a quiet smile to his face. So much of the farm, of the land, held these small imprints, not just of Henry, but of his parents, of neighbors, even of himself at different ages. It was a kind of invisible map, written in the bends of paths and the places where grass grew differently because someone had stood there often. The shadows had deepened when Samuel finally turned back toward home. The swing would be waiting, and perhaps he'd bring a small piece of the creek with him in memory. A coolness in the air, the rhythm of water against stone, the faint green glow of moss in the late light. Walking back through the orchard, he noticed how the apples caught the sun now, each one holding a small, bright reflection of the sky. The rows felt narrower in the deepening shade, the space between them filled with that gentle stillness that always seemed to come before night. By the time he reached the porch steps, the first stars would be appearing above the trees. The day would close without hurry, and the night would take its place in the same quiet rhythm that had always held this place together. Samuel knew he'd sleep well tonight, not because of the work he'd done, but because the day had been full in the right kind of way. The swing waited, the boards still warm from the sun, and the porch light would come on soon enough. Until then, there was the simple pleasure of sitting down again, letting the cool air drift in and feeling the weight of the day settle gently into the wood beneath him. By the time Samuel reached the porch, the first traces of evening had already slipped quietly into the yard. The light was not gone, but it had thinned into that gentle silver gold that comes only for a short while, the in-between time when the day is still holding on, yet the night has begun to lay its claim. He paused at the bottom of the steps, resting his hand on the worn railing. The boards were warm from the afternoon sun, and the faint scent of pine rose from them as if the wood itself remembered the forest it had once been. Somewhere beyond the orchard, a lone cricket had begun its slow, deliberate song. It was not urgent, not insistent, just a steady note. as if it knew there was no need to rush the night along. He climbed the steps and stood for a moment, looking out across the yard. The apple trees were now just darker shapes against a sky that was losing its blue, and in the far field, the tall grass had taken on that muted silver hue it wears under fading light. Even the wind seemed quieter here, moving only enough to send a soft rustle through the leaves. On the far post of the porch, the old lantern-shaped fixture waited. It had been there for as long as Samuel could remember. His father had wired it in when Samuel was still a boy. Its glass was a little clouded now, the brass dulled by weather, but it had always done its work without complaint. He reached up, turned the small switch beneath it, and the bulb inside flickered once, then glowed with a steady amber light. The glow pooled gently on the porch boards, spilling just far enough to brush the first few feet of the yard. Beyond that, the world remained in soft shadow, as if the light knew better than to intrude too far. Samuel eased himself back onto the porch swing, the chain giving its familiar sigh as it took his weight. The boards beneath his feet creaked slightly, but in a way that felt welcoming, like an old friend adjusting their chair to sit beside you. From here, the farmhouse felt like its own small island. The glow of the porch light formed a boundary that kept the rest of the world at a respectful distance. Inside that circle of light, the air seemed warmer, the wood smelled sweeter, and the troubles of the day, if they had ever been more than passing thoughts, were softened into something manageable, something that could wait until morning. He let the swing move just enough to keep the chains in motion, their faint creak in time with the slow rhythm of his breathing. A moth drifted toward the porch light, its wings catching the glow before it spun lazily away into the dark. Somewhere in the grass, another cricket joined the first, their calls weaving together into a slow duet. The quiet out here was not empty, it was layered. There was the low hum of the evening insects, the faint whisper of the wind through the orchard, the occasional creak of the swing. Each sound knew its place, and none tried to speak louder than it needed to. His thoughts, too, began to take on that same gentle order. They wandered over small things, the way the creek had felt cool against his hand earlier, the moss glowing softly on the far bank, the way the apples in the orchard had caught the late sun. There is no need to hold on to these moments, but they settled in him all the same. The way the light from the porch lantern settled into the grain of the boards. The house behind him was quiet. Through the screen door, he could hear the faint ticking of the kitchen clock, its sound softened by distance and wood. The air drifting from inside carried the scent of the evening meal, something with herbs, perhaps rosemary, still lingering. In the field, the darkness deepened. The stars were just beginning to prick through the dim blue above, each one appearing so faintly that he almost didn't notice until it was there. A thin crescent moon had risen low over the tree line, its light pale and cool, in contrast to the warm glow of the porch lamp. Samuel leaned back, the chain groaning slightly as the swing took him a little further into its arc. He remembered nights from long ago when his parents would sit out here together talking in low voices while he, as a boy, tried to catch words without being noticed. They had spoken of weather, of neighbors, of the rhythm of the farm. There had been no urgency to their words, no need to solve anything before the night was done. That same pace was here now, in the air, in the wood beneath him, in the gentle sway of the swing. After a while, he closed his eyes, not in weariness, but in the quiet trust that nothing in this moment needed him to be alert. The sounds of the evening could be trusted to continue without his attention. The porch light would keep its steady watch. The swing would hold him, and the darkness beyond would remain at a respectful distance. When he opened his eyes again, the stars had multiplied. The crescent moon had risen just enough to spill a thread of silver across the roof of the barn. In the stillness, Samuel felt the day folding itself neatly away, like a well-worn blanket laid carefully over the back of a chair. The night would go on like this, slow and unbroken, and he would stay here as long as the air was warm enough, rocking gently in the soft amber glow, listening to the porch light hum faintly in the quiet. It was a kind of peace he had learned not to question, peace that came not from seeking but from letting the day settle in its own time. When he finally rose, it would be only to step inside, turn the lock on the door, and let the stillness follow him into sleep. The swing would wait for him tomorrow. The porch light would glow again, and the night would carry its memories softly into morning. The first light of morning touched the edge of the porch in a way that was more suggestion than arrival. Soft, pale gold, brushing the wood like the first quiet knock of a familiar friend. It came not in a rush, but in a slow spilling, the way honey moves from a jar. The boards still held the coolness of night, though the faintest warmth was beginning to settle into them, carried from the horizon by the unhurried hands of the sun. Samuel stepped out, his boots in one hand, his feet bare on the cool planks. He did not wish to wake the house with the sound of soles on wood. The air held the smell of damp earth and something faintly sweet, perhaps the first blossoms from the honeysuckle by the barn. There was a weight to the morning stillness, not heavy, but full, like the pause before a sentence you know will be worth hearing. The porch swing sat as it had the night before, its chain still, its seat empty, but waiting. The soft outline of dew on its worn boards caught the light in tiny glimmers. Samuel touched it gently, the damp clinging to his fingertips, and for a moment he thought of how many mornings this swing had greeted, how many times it had been there to see the first break of day, when the rest of the world was still tucked beneath its blankets. The fields beyond the yard wore a thin layer of mist, rising just high enough to blur the line where earth met sky. The orchard was half veiled in it, the apple trees standing like patient figures, their leaves edged with silver dew. Somewhere deep among them a bird called, one low, steady note repeated at its own pace, not to hurry anyone, simply to announce that it too had woken. Samuel sat down on the swing, letting the chain give its morning groan, different from the slower sigh of the night before. This was a sound with more space in it, as though the wood and metal were stretching themselves after a long rest. He began to rock, gently at first, then with a little more sway, enough to hear the creak settle into a rhythm that matched the quiet beat of his own breath. From here, the mist looked like a river flowing low across the land, its current slow and unbroken. The barn, its red softened by the early light, seemed to float in it. Even the fence posts were half lost, their tops rising from the pale fog like stepping stones across an unseen path. The morning air touched Samuel's skin with the coolness that was not unwelcome. It was the kind that hinted at a warm day ahead, the sort of balance that made you grateful for both. He leaned back slightly, letting his bare feet skim the porch floorboards as the swing carried him forward and back. He thought of mornings years ago when he would slip out here before anyone else in the house stirred. Back then, the swing had been a little stiffer, the chains newer, the boards brighter. His father's boots would be by the door, lined with dust from the previous day's work, and the kitchen would be quiet except for the sound of the kettle heating for coffee. Now the boots were his, though he did not wear them until he had to, and the coffee would be his to make later. But the stillness, the unshaken, faithful stillness of the porch, was the same. It was the kind of quiet that didn't demand you fill it, the kind that could hold all the words you never spoke and all the thoughts you were still learning how to keep. From somewhere in the grass, the sound of a soft rustle reached him, perhaps a rabbit making its way toward the edge of the orchard. The mist shifted a little, opening a narrow window of clear air through which the sun poured a single warm beam onto the far fence. The light seemed to rest there for a moment, as if deciding whether to linger or to go on. The swing moved with the smallest of squeaks now, each one like a gentle reminder that time was passing even here. Samuel reached for the mug he had set beside him. Steam still curled from it, carrying the dark, grounding scent of the coffee he had poured minutes earlier. He took a slow sip, not for the wakefulness, but for the simple warmth of it in his hands. Beyond the orchard, the first hint of a breeze began to move the tops of the taller grass. The motion was so slight it could have been imagined, but the sound, soft, dry, like the pages of an old book being turned, was real. He stayed like this for a long while, rocking slowly, the coffee cooling in his hand, the morning widening around him in careful degrees. The mist began to lift, loosening its hold on the land, and the shapes of the world returned in their quiet, familiar lines. When the sun finally rose high enough to light the full breadth of the yard, it caught the porch swing in such a way that the old paint, faded, cracked, worn by countless seasons, seemed to glow faintly. It was the kind of light that made even age look like a gift, a soft patina that spoke of time well lived. Samuel reached out and ran his hand along the armrest, the grain of the wood rising beneath his palm. The porch had held mornings like this for decades, and if the boards creaked a little more now, or the swing moved with a slower sway, it was only because it knew there was no need to hurry. By the time he stood, the coffee was gone and the day had fully begun. But the quiet of the porch stayed with him, stitched into his thoughts the way the smell of honeysuckle stitched itself into the air. He knew he would return here again tomorrow, and the day after that, as long as the porch stood and the swing held. Some places ask nothing of you but your presence, and in return, they give you something that lingers long after you've stepped away. The porch boards gave a soft, familiar sigh under Samuel's feet as he stepped down onto the dew-laced grass. The coolness of it rose into the soles of his boots, reminding him that the day was still young enough to keep its secrets close. The air was calm, and in it hung the faint mingling scents of damp earth, early blossoms, and the lingering warmth of last night's fire, drifting faintly from the chimney. The orchard lay just beyond the fence, where the ground sloped gently down and the mist pooled in the hollows between the rows of trees. The grass was long here, and each blade bent under the weight of tiny droplets, so that as Samuel walked, the edges of his pant legs gathered a darkened sheen. He moved slowly, not because of any weariness, but because this was the kind of morning that asked to be noticed, not hurried through. In the hush, the sound of the barn's weather vane turning slightly was enough to seem like an event. Somewhere far off, a woodpecker began its steady work against the bark of a tree, the rhythm carrying across the damp air. The apple trees stood in quiet ranks, their limbs stretching outward as though they too were waking slowly. Each one had its own shape, its own way of holding the morning light. Samuel knew them well enough to tell them apart, though not by any system he could name, only by long acquaintance, the way you know the voices of old friends even when they speak in a whisper. The first tree on the left, with its slightly twisted trunk, was one he remembered climbing as a boy. In the crook where the branches split, there had once been a small tin box he had hidden away, a box that held nothing more valuable than a marble, a smooth skipping stone, and a scrap of paper with his boyhood handwriting. He doubted the box was still there, but the thought of it warmed him as he passed beneath the same branches, now heavier, their bark thickened by years. The mist thinned as he moved deeper into the orchard, though it clung a little longer to the lower branches, curling around them like breath that refused to fade. A robin flew low across his path, its wings catching the light in a brief shimmer before it vanished into the grass to search for breakfast. Samuel paused beside one of the older trees, running his hand along the cool, rough bark. The surface held the marks of seasons past, the faint scars where limbs had been trimmed, the weather-worn ridges where the trunk had grown thicker. It reminded him that even here, in this stillness, time was always moving, shaping the world in small, unhurried increments. He remembered mornings long ago when his father would walk the same path, carrying a basket in one hand and whistling softly under his breath. There had been a steadiness in the way his father moved, as if he knew there was more to tending an orchard than the fruit it would bear. It was the care between the seasons, the pruning, the waiting, the quiet tending, that gave the place its life. Near the center of the orchard stood a bench, its wood darkened by years of rain and sun. Samuel sat there now, letting the quiet gather around him. From here, he could see the farmhouse through the thinning mist, the porch swing just a small curve of shadow beneath the eaves. The distance was not far, yet it gave the sense of being in a world apart. The bench was cool beneath him, the air faintly warmer where the sun began to thread its way through the branches. Light touched the edges of the leaves, turning each droplet of dew into a small point of brightness. A soft breeze moved through, carrying with it the scent of the orchard's early blossoms, a sweetness that was neither heavy nor fleeting, but something that seemed to belong to the very bones of the place. He leaned back slightly, closing his eyes for a moment, listening. The rustle of the leaves was joined now by the gentle hum of insects, just waking and moving about their work. Somewhere to the east, a rooster called, its voice carrying without urgency. In the stillness, Samuel's thoughts wandered in the slow, unforced way that happens when there is no need to direct them. He thought of letters tucked into drawers, of the creak of the old porch swing on summer nights, of the steady ticking of the clock in the kitchen during long winter evenings. He thought of how each place he knew had its own particular silence, and how the orchard's silence was softer than most, like the quiet between pages in a book you are not in a hurry to finish. The bench had been here for as long as he could remember. He had sat on it with his sister, the two of them sharing an apple, their bare feet brushing the grass below. He had sat here alone on mornings after the first frost, watching his breath hang in the air. He had sat here once, years ago, with someone whose laughter had stayed with him longer than their footsteps ever did. When he opened his eyes again, the mist was lifting in greater measure, revealing the subtle slopes and turns of the land beyond the orchard. The light had deepened, carrying with it the promise of a warm day. He rose slowly, brushing the damp from his hands, and began to walk again, this time taking a path that curved toward the far edge of the property. The grass here was shorter, the ground firmer, and the air held the faint sound of water, the small creek that wound its way through the fields. He would go there next, though without haste. For now, the orchard had given him what he needed, a reminder that the world in its quiet corners still holds more gentleness than we often remember to notice. And perhaps, he thought, that is why he returned to it morning after morning, not for the fruit, not even for the beauty, but for the way it asked nothing of him but his presence. The path narrowed as Samuel left the orchard behind, the trees giving way to a wide stretch of meadow that sloped gently toward the far edge of the property. Here, the grass grew in varying shades of green, some blades still slick with dew, others already warmed by the slow reach of sunlight. Small clusters of wildflowers, violet, white, and yellow, speckled the field like quiet notes of color in an otherwise hushed morning. From somewhere ahead came the sound of water, a light, unhurried murmur, the kind of sound that blends so perfectly into the stillness that you might not notice it at first, but once you did, it became impossible to ignore. The creek had a way of calling you closer, not loudly, but with the steady patience of something that had been there long before you and would remain long after. Samuel followed the sound until the meadow dipped, revealing a narrow ribbon of water weaving between low banks. The creek wasn't wide, perhaps no more than a few strides across, but it held a clarity that made every smooth stone beneath its surface visible. Sunlight caught the ripples in a way that turned them to silver threads, winding endlessly toward a bend in the distance. He paused at the bank, letting his gaze travel along the water's surface. Tiny bubbles formed where it slipped over hidden rocks, rising and breaking with the sound too soft to name. A dragonfly darted low, its wings flashing with each shift of light, before it settled on a reed that bent slightly under its weight. Somewhere downstream, a frog gave a slow, deliberate croak, as if it had all the time in the world to be heard. Kneeling, Samuel dipped a hand into the current. The water was cool enough to startle him at first, then simply refreshing. He let it flow over his fingers, carrying with it the faint scent of moss and wet earth. That scent, combined with the steady sound of the creek, pulled him back to mornings from decades ago. Mornings when he had followed his father to this very spot, carrying a small tin pail. They would kneel together at the edge, scooping water to wash their faces before the day's work began, the cold sting waking them better than any cup of coffee could. He remembered, too, the days when he came here alone, skipping stones across the water's surface, each one leaving a brief trail of ripples before sinking. It had been a quiet kind of game, one without a winner, where the only measure of success was how long you could make the circles last before the creek swallowed them whole. Samuel stepped onto a flat rock that jutted partway into the stream. The rock was warm on its sunlit side and damp on the shaded edge where the water brushed against it. Sitting down, he let his boots dangle just above the surface, close enough to feel the faint mist from the splashes of small fish breaking the water now and then. Across from him, the opposite bank rose into a tangle of willows and alder trees. Their roots reached down like searching fingers, some dipping into the stream as if to drink. He could hear the soft rustle of their leaves in the breeze, a sound that mingled so easily with the water that it was hard to tell where one ended and the other began. The creek was never in a hurry. Even when the spring rain swelled it, its voice remained steady and calm. It moved with a purpose that had nothing to do with speed, winding through the land as though it had chosen the most thoughtful path possible. Samuel found comfort in that. The world beyond the farm might race forward, but here, the water taught another rhythm, one worth listening to. He leaned back on his hands, tilting his head toward the sky. Above him, the clouds drifted with the same unhurried pace as the creek. Their edges glowed faintly in the rising sun, and between them stretched wide patches of soft blue. A single hawk circled high, its shadow sweeping briefly over the meadow before it turned back toward the hills. Samuel's thoughts, slow and drifting like the clouds, wandered to the years he had spent away from this place. There had been stretches of time when the creek was nothing more than a memory, a distant thread of sound and light in his mind, and yet each time he returned, it felt unchanged, as if it had been quietly waiting, keeping the same notes in its song. Perhaps, he thought, that was the nature of certain places. They did not demand you come back, but when you did, they offered the same welcome as before. No judgment for the time you had been gone, no need to explain yourself, just a steady assurance that you belonged there, in whatever way you could. A small stick floated past, turning slowly in the current before catching against a cluster of river stones. He watched it for a while, imagining it was a tiny boat with nowhere particular to go. The image made him smile, a quiet smile that stayed with him even as he rose to his feet. Samuel followed the creek upstream, where it narrowed and quickened for a short stretch. Here, the water tumbled over smooth rocks, its voice lifting just slightly above a murmur. Ferns grew thick along the bank, their fronds beaded with moisture. He ran a hand lightly over them, the cool droplets clinging to his skin. The path along this part of the bank was uneven, but he moved without hurry, pausing often to listen, to notice the glint of light on the water, the delicate arcs of spiderwebs strung between low branches, each holding a tiny world of dew. The farther he went, the more he felt the rest of the day slip away, not in the sense of losing it, but of being freed from its demands. Eventually, the creek curved back toward the meadow, its voice fading as the land rose again. Samuel stood for a long moment at the bend, looking back at where he had come from. The water caught the sunlight in such a way that it seemed almost to glow, and he knew that later he would see that same light from the porch, and it would remind him of this moment. He turned toward home then, not because he was finished with the creek, but because it would always be here. The walk back would be just as slow as the walk there, each step measured, each breath full of the quiet morning air. And when he reached the porch again, the swing would be waiting, ready to hold him the way the creek had held his thoughts. By the time Samuel returned from the creek, the sun had shifted to a warmer hue, spreading itself across the land like a slow-poured ribbon of gold. Afternoon light was different from morning light. It didn't reach as far, but what it touched seemed to glow from within. The long grasses in the meadow leaned into its warmth, their tips bending slightly, and the old wooden boards of the porch welcomed it like an old friend. The swing was waiting for him in the same quiet way it always did. Its chains gave a faint creak as he lowered himself into it, the sound as familiar as the low hum of bees in summer clover. He sat for a moment without moving, feeling the way the slats of the seat fit against his back, the way the wood had molded slightly over time to hold a body in rest. He let the swing sway with the smallest motion, just enough to feel the gentle pull forward and the easing back. The rhythm was unhurried, like the breathing of someone who had already drifted toward sleep. From here, the farm stretched out in a soft panorama, the orchard in the distance, the creek hidden beyond it, and nearer still, the kitchen garden with its neat rows of beans, tomatoes, and squash. Everything seemed to exist in a comfortable silence, disturbed only by the occasional rustle of wind in the porch eaves. On the small table beside him sat a ceramic mug, the surface worn smooth by years of use. Inside was a blend of chamomile and lemon balm, herbs that grew in a patch just beyond the garden fence. The steam curled upward in thin threads, carrying with it the scent of summer evenings in quiet kitchens. He cradled the mug in both hands, not drinking just yet but letting the warmth seep into his palms. When he finally lifted it to his lips, the first sip was as gentle as a remembered kindness. The chamomile had a way of softening the edges of thought, while the lemon balm carried a brightness that kept the calm from feeling heavy. He drank slowly, each mouthful leaving a lingering comfort that stayed even after the taste had faded. As he looked out over the fields, Samuel's mind wandered to the many afternoons that had ended in this very seat. Some had been shared with others, friends who dropped by without warning, neighbors who stayed long enough for the sky to turn pink. They would talk in the unhurried way people do when there is no schedule to keep, letting words find their place between the shared silences. Other afternoons had been entirely his own. On those days, the swing was less a piece of furniture and more a companion, one that listened without interruption, that matched its movement to his thoughts. The porch itself seemed to hold the echoes of those hours, storing them somewhere in the grain of its wood, ready to release them when the light was right. From somewhere down the road came the faint sound of a tractor, its low engine hum blending into the warm air. Samuel could picture it moving slowly along the edge of a neighbor's field, the driver's cap tilted back, one hand resting lightly on the wheel. It was a sound that belonged to this place as much as the chirp of crickets or the whistle of the wind through tall corn. He closed his eyes, letting the swing carry him, and in that gentle rocking he felt time loosen its hold. The weight of past days, the questions about days yet to come, they all seemed to drift to the far edge of the porch and dissolve into the late afternoon haze. In their place was only the simple truth of the moment, the warmth of the mug in his hands, the sigh of wind across the fields, the steady comfort of the swing beneath him. When he opened his eyes again, the light had shifted slightly, casting long shadows across the porch boards. A sparrow landed on the railing a few feet away, its small claws tapping softly as it tilted its head toward him. For a moment, they regarded each other in the kind of stillness that feels like a shared understanding. Then, with a brief flick of wings, it was gone, leaving behind only the faint memory of its presence. Samuel finished the last of his tea, setting the mug back on the table with a quiet clink. The air carried the scent of the evening meal cooking somewhere in the distance. Maybe a neighbor's kitchen, where bread was baking or soup simmering on the stove. The smell wove itself into the golden light, making the moment feel whole and complete. The swing continued to move with its own rhythm, each arc forward a reminder that rest need not be earned, only accepted. Samuel let it carry him a while longer, not thinking of what he might do next, but simply allowing the day to settle around him like a well-worn quilt. Out beyond the meadow, the hills caught the last bright threads of sunlight, holding them just a little longer before they would sink into dusk. Soon the porch lamp would glow, and the night would lay its quiet hand over the farm. But for now, there is only the swing, the afternoon light, and the kind of peace that asks for nothing more than your presence. The sun was already beginning its long descent when Samuel noticed how the air had changed. Afternoon warmth was still resting on the porch boards, but the edges of it were softening, touched by the cool hand of evening. The light no longer poured across the fields, it lingered instead, as though reluctant to leave, turning the tops of the grasses into fine golden threads. The swing beneath him creaked gently as he let it sway. Each slow arc forward carried with it the scent of the meadow, dry grass, earth warmed all day, and a faint trace of wild mint from somewhere near the fence line. These were the scents that marked the end of a summer's day, and they came to him now like old friends arriving quietly at the door. Out beyond the orchard, the hills seemed to lean closer to the horizon, as if settling themselves for the night. The shadows stretched long between the rows of apple trees, and the wind slipped through them in a slow whisper. It was the kind of a wind that didn't stir much. It just passed over things, touching them lightly, like a hand resting on his shoulder. Samuel reached for his mug, though it was nearly empty. The tea had cooled, but he drank the last of it anyway, tasting the faint sweetness that lingered. The ceramic was cool now, the heat long given away to his hands. He set it back down on the little table beside him, listening to the faint click it made against the wood. In the distance, a mourning dove called, its low, round notes carrying across the open fields. It was a sound he had heard on hundreds of evenings just like this, always at that hour when the day is neither fully light nor fully dark, when the world seems to breathe out in contentment. He had come to think of that sound as a kind of permission to let go of the day's work, permission to simply sit and watch the sky change. From the road came the soft murmur of a neighbor's truck passing by. The sound was neither hurried nor loud, just a gentle reminder that life moved quietly here, each person moving at the pace the land allowed. The hum of the engine faded quickly, leaving the porch once again wrapped in stillness. The swing rocked on. Samuel's feet brushed lightly against the porch boards with each slow motion, the wood worn smooth by years of use. He looked down at the grain, noticing how it had darkened in some places where rain had soaked in over the years, and how in other places it still kept the pale color of its younger days. The boards told their own story, and he found himself tracing it with his eyes, as if he could read the years there. The first star appeared above the orchard, faint but steady. Samuel caught sight of it in the gap between two branches, its small light trembling against the fading blue of the sky. Soon there would be more, whole constellations unfolding themselves overhead. But for now, that single point of light felt enough. It was a promise, in its way, that the night would come as it always had, bringing with it its own quiet blessings. The chorus of crickets began somewhere out near the fence row, their sound rising and falling in soft waves. Each note seemed to settle deeper into the evening air, layering itself over the hum of the fields. Samuel listened to them with the same patience he had for old friends telling familiar stories. There was comfort in their constancy. In the kitchen behind him, a faint glow appeared in the window as the first lamp was lit. The light was golden, warm against the gathering blue outside. He thought of the table inside, with its neat stack of plates, the bread cooling on a rack, and the pitcher of fresh water drawn from the well that morning. Supper could wait. Evening was too fine to leave just yet. The swing carried him gently forward and back, forward and back. The rhythm was as steady as the pulse of the land itself, unbroken by thought or worry. His shoulders loosened, his breathing slowed, and the small muscles around his eyes softened. There was nothing here to rush toward and nothing to turn away from, only the present moment, wrapped in the scent and sound of the countryside at rest. Somewhere deep in the orchard, a single apple dropped to the ground, the thud softened by grass. Samuel smiled to himself. It was a small sound, but it belonged entirely to this place, to this hour. It was the kind of sound you might miss if you were thinking too far ahead, but if you were quiet, if you were patient, it came to you like a gift. He let the swing slow to a gentle stop, the chains giving one last soft creak before resting still. His hands folded loosely in his lap as he looked out over the meadow. The hills were fading into shadow now, their outlines softening against the deepening sky. Somewhere beyond them, the sun was slipping out of sight, leaving the land to the care of the night. As the air cooled further, Samuel knew it would soon be time to light the porch lamp, but he lingered for one more moment, feeling the evening settle around him like a quilt being drawn up over his shoulders. The crickets sang, the stars gathered, and the quiet stretched wide and deep. He breathed it in, the peace, the slowness, the knowing that this day, like so many before it, had ended in the gentle way he had hoped it would. And in that breath, there was no room for anything but gratitude. Samuel rose from the old porch swing slowly, as though not to disturb the balance the evening had so carefully built. His hands pressed lightly against the worn armrests, feeling the soft give of the wood that had been warmed by his weight in the fading heat of the day. The swing gave a final, almost imperceptible sigh on its chains, then settled into stillness behind him. He stepped toward the small table where the oil lamp sat, its chimney faintly smudged from use. The lamp had been there every summer for as long as he could remember. Its base was brass, dulled with age but still catching a little of the twilight in a soft glow. He turned the small wheel on the side and struck the match, cupping it against the breeze. The flame caught, wavered, then bloomed into a steady light, drawing a gentle halo across the boards of the porch. The first moments of lamplight always carried with them a kind of quiet ceremony. It was the shift between the day's open face and the night's folded calm. The world beyond the porch was now deepening into shadow, but here, under the light, there was a small circle of gold where every detail, the grain of the wood, the threads in the cushion on the swing, the gentle steam from a fresh cup of tea, seemed touched with kindness. Inside the house, the air was cooler, touched by the faint scent of baking bread. Samuel had set the loaf on the counter earlier, its crust now firm, the inside still soft and fragrant. He poured himself a glass of water from the pitcher by the sink, the coolness of it running through his hands before he took a slow drink. The water tasted of the well, a taste both clean and grounding, carrying with it the memory of countless evenings just like this one. On the table by the window, a small notebook lay open. The pages were filled with neat, deliberate handwriting, lists of planting dates, sketches of the orchard, a line or two of poetry copied from an old book. Samuel sat there for a moment, pen in hand, though he didn't write right away. Outside the window, he could see the porch swing, its chains catching a touch of lamplight. The night was gathering itself now. From beyond the orchard, the sound of frogs had begun, their voices rising in unhurried intervals. The stars, once scattered and tentative, were now strewn thick across the sky, their light falling in soft dust over the roof and fields. Samuel set down his pen, content to leave the page unfinished. Some evenings it was enough simply to sit and notice. He thought about how many times the porch swing had carried him through hours like this, in all seasons, in the scent of lilacs in spring, the heavy warmth of summer nights, the drift of leaves in autumn, and even the still frost of winter. The swing had been there. It had held more than just his weight. It had held his thinking, his remembering, his quiet letting go. After a while, Samuel rose and returned to the porch. The lamp was burning steady now, its glass chimney warm to the touch. He adjusted the wick slightly, watching the flame lean and then stand tall again. In the lamp's glow, the air between him and the edge of the porch seemed almost tangible, as though the light had made the space itself into something you could rest your hand against. The meadow beyond had vanished into shadow, though he could still sense its shape by the way the cricket's song carried across it. The orchard was a dark silhouette against the night, the shapes of the trees bending gently in the occasional breeze. Every so often he could hear the faint tap of an apple loosening from its branch and finding the ground. He sat again in the swing, letting it move in the smallest of motions, more a shift of weight than a true sway. The lamplight didn't quite reach the farthest boards of the porch, and beyond that, the darkness was complete. Samuel felt the edges of his awareness soften, as though the night was encouraging him to let go of the shape of things and simply rest inside their presence. Somewhere in the stillness, he thought he could feel the memory of other evenings layered beneath this one. His father sitting with him when he was small, pointing out the first star, his mother humming softly from the kitchen, a friend leaning back with a mug of coffee in the cool of early autumn. These memories didn't arrive sharply. They came like the gentle return of a tide, touching the shore of his mind before slipping back into the wide dark. He leaned back, feeling the quiet settle into his bones. The lamp burned low and steady. The air was rich with the scents of wood and earth, and the swing's small creak was the only sound close enough to claim his attention. Out here, on this old porch in the quiet countryside, Samuel understood that peace wasn't something you chased. It was something you allowed to meet you where you were. And so, he sat, breathing, listening, letting the night come fully. The old porch swing moved just enough to remind Samuel it was still with him, even in the stillness. The oil lamp, steady and unhurried, cast its amber glow over the boards, the wicker chair in the corner, and the chipped ceramic cup beside his hand. The tea inside had long gone cool, but its fragrance, soft, floral, touched with honey, lingered in the air as if unwilling to leave. It was the hour when the world seemed to have exhaled completely. The sky had deepened into a velvet so rich that even the brightest stars looked as though they were suspended within it rather than above it. The cricket's steady chorus made the night feel whole, as if every living thing had agreed to the same gentle rhythm. Samuel's gaze drifted beyond the porch to the faint outline of the old maple by the gate. By day, its branches reached like open arms toward the road. By night, it became a watchful shadow, quietly marking the space between the house and the world beyond. He thought of how many seasons that tree had seen, how many evenings it had stood there as the porch light flickered on, how many quiet moments it had kept for the people who passed beneath it. The thought was comforting. There was something steady in knowing that the world held its own memory, that even when we are gone, the things we have touched will remember us in their own way. He leaned back, feeling the swing accept his weight as though it had been waiting for him all along. The chains gave a faint sigh, and the movement of the swing made the light from the lamp shift across the porch boards like a slow tide. The night seemed to wrap around him, not in a way that shut out the world, but in a way that made him feel part of it, woven into the hum of insects, the distant rustle of leaves, the low murmur of the creek somewhere beyond the orchard. A memory surfaced, soft and unhurried, his father's voice on a night much like this one, telling him not to rush the ending of the day. The night has its own way of speaking, his father had said. If you listen long enough, you'll hear it say everything you need to know. Samuel closed his eyes for a moment, letting the truth of that linger. The night did speak, though not in words. It spoke in the coolness that brushed his cheek, in the way the stars settled deeper into the sky, in the steady burn of the lamp at his side. Inside, the house waited quietly. The bed was turned down, the quilt folded back, the pillow softened by years of use. Soon he would rise from the swing, turn down the lamp, and step into that cool, still room. But not yet. For now, there was no need to move. The porch, the swing, the lamplight, and the dark fields beyond were all part of the same moment. One that didn't need to be hurried or held too tightly. Samuel let out a slow breath, and with it, the last threads of the day seemed to drift away. What remained was simple and complete, the deep comfort of knowing he was exactly where he needed to be. The swing swayed once more, the lamp's glow held steady, and the night, quiet, whole, and watchful, held everything. And somewhere, as the old porch kept its gentle vigil, Samuel knew that when he finally rose and stepped inside, sleep would meet him not as an escape, but as a homecoming. And so, as the old porch swing settles into its stillness, and the night folds gently over the quiet countryside, we come to the end of our time together. May you carry this calm into your own rest tonight, letting the sounds, the memories, and the warmth of this place stay with you as you drift away. Wherever you are, I hope the world feels a little softer now. I hope the weight you've been carrying has eased just enough for sleep to find you with ease. Good night, my friend. May your dreams be kind and your heart feel light until morning. If you'd like to share your thoughts, I would love to read them. And perhaps you could tell me, what story would you like me to tell you next?